Hey, it's Eric G. Around the House is sponsored by Baldwin Hardware. For 75 years, Baldwin Hardware has been known for its first-class quality and craftsmanship in door and cabinetry hardware. As an alumnus of the Baldwin Hardware Design Council, I can say I have seen the details and quality from design to the finished product. If you're looking for a new style and old-world craftsmanship, I can tell you there is only one Baldwin Hardware. Check out what would look great in your home at baldwinhardware.com.
It's Around the House.
To make sure you're carrying that load. And that is one of the things that we see many times in homes before 1960, many times in many areas. There was not an engineer or even an architect that looked at it. It was a set of canned plans, and that was good enough. And the builder didn't really need to have permits. And that's one of those things or inspections. Great example. 1950s home. I've been working with my brother out on the coast. When we got into the electric on it, we were pulling out the drywall that was wet. We saw where the electrician in 1954, when they ran out of wire going to another run, they buried it in the wall, they tied together, spliced in the next.
When it comes to remodeling and renovating your home, there is a lot to know, but we've got you covered. This is Around the House.
Around the House show is brought to you by Pyramid Heating and Cooling. Serving in Oregon, the Portland metro area, and Bend, Oregon, they are your one-stop shop for heating and cooling and indoor air quality. To find out more, head to pyramidheating.com. Oregon CCB 59382. Welcome to the Around the House show, the next generation of home improvement. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Eric G. Wow, I can't believe we are running into the last half of July. This summer is flying by. We've got a great show lined up for you today. First off, though, if you want to find out more about me and Around the House, just head over to our website, aroundthehouseonline.com, and you'll find the phone number for the studio there. You'll find all of our social media. You'll find our videos. We've got almost 500 videos for the television show now on the YouTube playlist, and so there's so many things for you to find right there, all in one place. Today, I wanted to talk about project questions and stuff that might help you through your next project. And this is one we had come in via request. How do you find out if that wall is load bearing? And we're going to talk about toxic projects in your garage and maybe something you're working on right now. So we'll be talking about that later on in the show today in this hour. First off, load bearing walls. This is a big one. It comes up all the time. Hey, I want to make this kitchen into an open concept, take out that wall, all of those kind of things. Hey, I want to move this wall 3 feet this way. I want to make this room bigger. All of those things come up. And the question always is this wall load bearing? So the first thing, and what is a load bearing wall? A load bearing wall is what's carrying the structure or carrying some weight of the structure above it. Now, you could have a load-bearing walls are not just, is it load-bearing or not? It can carry some load, which I guess is load-bearing. But these are things that you need to figure out if this is just a partition wall that doesn't need to be there, or if it's something that a builder or an engineer, if your house was engineered, is that part of it. So if you're in a single-story house, this is what I would recommend first. And if you've got a basement or a crawl space, this is where you can take a look. So let's say you want to blow out that kitchen wall. The first thing I want to do is figure out where that is in relation to your crawl space opening and get underneath it. Because one of the things that'll make it load bearing is that load transferred all the way down to the ground below. Now, you can't always see. It could be framed in and there could be another beam carrying it and carrying it over, but you want to see if that load underneath it is carried all the way to the ground. For instance, if you go look at that kitchen wall that you want to take out to make that kitchen bigger, and you get underneath there and figure out, wow, there is a beam or there is some footings right underneath this wall, I look at it and go, all right, there's one check mark. Maybe that is load bearing. And so if that wall is carried all the way down to the soil and into a footing or something like that, or into a beam that goes over to it, that could be load bearing. So the next thing I want to do is take a look up above it. What is coming down? And if you get up there and there's trusses, that doesn't give you a clear answer because maybe that wall was designed to be there. But many times in older homes prior to the 1960s, you'll see stick framed systems up above, and maybe there is a support coming down on that, or there's a couple 2x4s coming down that's holding up the roof system, and that could be load bearing. Now, it's even more important if you get up there and all of a sudden you see that the ceiling joists are basically seamed on that wall. So if it comes over 10 feet and you've got another 14 feet beyond that, and that is the seam between those, it is definitely load bearing. And so that is when you really need to stop and take a look at it and say, okay, we need to figure out a plan. And now most exterior walls are load bearing, and it's depending on the load, depending on where the load's coming from. Because there is a little bit of load on a gable end, for instance, but if your ceiling joists or if your, let's say your roof system is going crossways, then those exterior walls that's resting on is where that load is. But really when it comes down to it, guys, this is where you need to bring in that structural engineer. This is where you need to bring it in and have them take a look and tell you what your answer is. So the first thing I want to do is have them come out, take a look, do a report for you, and they'll go, hey, is this structural? Yes. I don't mean a contractor, a structural engineer. I want them to come out and go, yes, that is load bearing. And then your next question is, cool, can I remove this and put a beam in? And that's where you start getting answers, right? That's where they start saying yes. And then you want them to calculate that beam. Because here's the thing. If you're going to be pulling building permits for this, where in most places in the country, they're going to require that, they're going to require here in the US that you have an engineering stamp on that as well. So this person's going to be the one that's going to want to stamp that drawing that you turn in. So you'll want them to do the drawings for you. That way you can do what they recommend. And then on top of that, they're going to tell you what needs to go all the way down to the ground. So if you have that crawl space, for instance, they're going to come in there and say, hey, we need to put different size footings in down below to carry this new load because maybe they're not big enough. And that's one thing that we see with many older homes and what new building code is. They come in usually and say, wow, we need footings much bigger. Great example. We had a project, and I've talked about this on the show before, where somebody had converted a attic space into living space decades ago. Contractor and I was the designer. Contractor was in there. I was doing a bathroom remodel upstairs. They pulled the permits. And of course, we had to upgrade that whole upper floor to meet building code. And unfortunately, that came down through the second floor. So this was a 2-story home with a basement. So 3 floors of living space. We actually had to go down into the finished basement, tear the flooring up, and pour much bigger footings to carry that load all the way down just to finish that top floor that was storage space like many 1920s homes. We had to do that to make sure that we carried that load back down. So many times you will need to have bigger footings down there as well to make sure you're carrying that load. And that is one of the things that we see many times in homes before 1960, many times in many areas. There was not an engineer or even an architect that looked at it. It was a set of canned plans, and that was good enough. And the builder didn't really need to have permits. And that's one of those things that, or inspections. Great example. 1950s home. I've been working with my brother out on the coast. And here in Cannon Beach, I've been working on it with him out there. When we got into the electric on it, we were pulling out the drywall that was wet. We saw where the electrician in 1954 didn't put in a correct, what would have been code or even safe. They literally hot wired when they ran out of wire going to another run. They buried it in the wall. They tied together, spliced in the next roll of wire and kept going. There was not a box there. There was no outlet. They didn't even put any access to that. It was just a connection buried in the wall. And so many times older homes, and for the people out there that go, they sure don't build them like they used to. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Many times that old house isn't going to meet building code currently because it's just not built strong enough to meet current code. And I know that's a controversial subject, but many of our 1920s homes these days, if you tried to build it exactly like that, engineering's not going to sign off on it. They want bigger footings. They want bigger beams. They want more structure. So these are things that we run into when we're trying to do these things, because obviously we need to build this area back up to code. Now, when we come back, I'm going to talk about a few other things that are just as important as is this a load-bearing wall? And we'll do that just as soon as Around the House returns. Don't go anywhere. Do you want to be an Around the House insider? For less than a cup of coffee a month, you can get exclusive extended episodes, early access to the weekend show, and exclusive access to me, Eric G, for project questions and comments. Click on the link on your podcast player in the show notes, or head to aroundthehouseonline.com and look for the Join Here button. Plus, the exclusive episodes are nearly commercial free. I don't want you to miss out on any of the giveaways or special offers. Thanks for tuning in to Around the House. Hey, it's Eric G from Around the House. Are you tired of low quality water in your home? Do you have bad tasting water? How about chemicals, minerals, and hard water scale tearing up your bathrooms, appliances, and your water heater? I have a great solution for you. It's time you stop the damage and check out King Water Filtration. This water treatment system takes care of every drop of water that comes into your home. It uses no salt, no expense filters to change, and it's made right here in the USA. Plus, it prevents hard water scale. To find out more information, head to kingwaterfiltration.com, and if you use promo code ERIC-23, it will give you $1,000 off MSRP with a discount on a filter that will resolve those water quality issues. Don't miss out on this amazing sale on a product made right here in the USA at kingwaterfiltration.com. That's kingwaterfiltration.com. And don't forget promo code ERIC-23. Welcome back to the Around the House show. I'm Eric G. Thanks for joining me today. If you're catching us on the podcast internationally, thanks for tuning in today. If you're listening to us on the Talk Media Network on one of our stations that are across 5 time zones in the United States, I appreciate every one of you tuning in. And that is why for our podcast listeners, we'll say welcome back, and we'll talk about, because people many times on the national radio show will be just joining us because they're out running around on the weekend, catching the show for the very first time, and we try to give that information out. So thanks for putting up with us, saying these things a couple times, 3 or 4 times in each episode. Today we've been talking about project questions, and the first one here, what is load bearing? And of course, the engineer is the one that has to give you that final answer, that structural engineer. But some of the things that you need to be careful with, and we were just talking about load and making sure that that was taken all the way down to the ground. And that's why you want that structural engineer. But sometimes there's more to it than just load. Sometimes we have shear walls and things that have to be added when we take structure out of a building. What is a shear wall? You know, if a shear wall basically keeps a building from racking from one side to the other. It gives us strength one way or the other. So if we're putting a shear wall in, many times what that is we've got a wall that has plywood or OSB before it's finished, and there's a certain nailing pattern to keep that wall stiff so it doesn't rack from side to side. And that is going to be like the backbone of the house. So these are things that you really need to make sure. And again, shear was not taken into account so much back in the day. Now, they did go in and put bracing in walls and things like that. So it's not that it's that, but if you're going in and modifying it, it's something, if you have a lot of glass, a lot of openings in an exterior wall, these are things that you should be paying attention to. And that's why that engineer is always good to go in there and make sure that it's good and make sure that it's done correctly. Because I have gone in many times where we've opened homes up, we've done some changes on stuff in the 70s and 60s, and we've had to come in with steel frames or moment frames to hold things together and to make sure that a fireplace is being supported correctly or anything else. And so sometimes these get to be much bigger projects just to be able to do the things we want to do within that house. And so that's really why that structural engineer is so important on these kind of projects. So it's not only is it load bearing, but is it shear. Now, when people are putting beams in, I have seen some crazy, horrible wrong ways of doing it on YouTube. I saw one guy who's a pretty big DIY influencer out there. And I'll say influencer because guess what? They didn't do this right. They needed to take out a wall in there. Probably do a video on this one of these days. It was so crazy. They did a video of taking out the load-bearing wall in the, basically it was in their living room to kitchen. And they came in there, did it completely wrong. So what they did is they went in and put a beam up above and then used hurricane straps to tie into that to hold the system up. And they carried that down over to some other walls and then took the wall out and used the beam up above to carry it. Hurricane straps are meant to keep the roof together. It's not meant to hang something from. Those are meant to keep the roof from lifting off, not to hang a ceiling system down below it. So clearly the wrong use of brackets, clearly the not engineered solution. And of course they made a DIY video and tell you how to do, remove a load bearing wall, which is really horrible because I don't want people to do this wrong and then have structural issues later. What are the structural issues that can happen? Let's talk about it. I've seen situations where roof will start to cave in. You'll see things move around. I've seen structural walls where they go in and take stuff out and all of a sudden you've got a sag in the roof line. The extreme is I've seen people doing stuff in basement walls where basement walls have collapsed in. In theory, you could have a partial collapse of a house. Most of the time, it's going to tell you things beforehand, but all of a sudden doors aren't opening and you get real big structural issues. And if there's a floor above, many times you'll see, why is that tile breaking up in the bathroom and things like that. So those are things you really need to be very careful of as you see these kind of things that you're doing this stuff correctly. And many times homes were done incorrectly. They took a wall out and didn't account for that load. And all of a sudden, people get in there and go, why does this wall keep cracking? Something's moving around. So it's something to be very careful with. So this is where, again, talking about projects, making sure that you've got that structural engineer is part of the process on this. You can bring over friends, you can bring over experts, you can bring over that, but there really is only one expert. It's not the contractor, it is the structural engineer. Now, a good set of eyes can look up there and go, yeah, there's no way that this is structural. This is just a partition wall, and it's not that big a deal because you can look at the system if you know what you're looking at. So refer on the friends, but when it comes down to it, of course, the engineer is your final answer. So make sure you got that dialed in. I wanted to talk here about toxic stuff in the shop and toxic things around the house on these projects and stuff that can really be a problem for you. And the first one is just many of the chemicals that we store. And we talked about this in our indoor air quality thing. But be really careful with the chemicals you're storing in an attached garage, basement, that kind of stuff. Any of those thinners, paints, any of those things are giving off plenty of industrial cleaners. Any of these things are really giving off chemicals and can be really toxic inside the house. So be very careful. The next one, and this is really a big one here. If you have a house that was built before 2015, there's a chance that you've got asbestos in the house. Now, in my area, before 2004, basically, I have to test materials that are certain before I can take them to the landfill here. So in my area, I can't take roofing felt, period. They won't accept it. If I have any kind of a vinyl or a linoleum type flooring or glues, drywall texture, drywall mud, those kind of things, before 2004, I have to have it tested before I take it down to the landfill. It has to be tested in my house. I have to make sure and have that paperwork before I take it down there to dispose of it. Now, you see on social media people that have these 60s and 70s and 80s houses and they pull stuff up and they're like, oh, I got this black tar glue underneath these 9x9 tiles that were hard. First off, if those were a linoleum type tile or a vinyl asbestos tile, those tiles right there at 9x9, most of the time are going to be asbestos filled. Not saying the 12x12s aren't, but 9x9s almost always were because those were a premium flooring. So that's a big one right there. That black mastic underneath, many times, is toxic as well with asbestos and other chemicals. So be very careful. If you see those tiles break up and you see that black tar underneath, it is a black tar mastic, stop, test it, take a look at it. And I know people go, oh, I wore a dust mask. That's great. It's actually not. Because the problem with asbestos is if you get it airborne, get it friable, what happens is that stuff can stick in the air in the house for years to come. So you can get multiple exposures well beyond you. Hey, I tore it out and got rid of it. You could have that hanging in the dust for the next handful of years. And that's just going to give you multiple asbestos exposures, which that can get you in the hospital or with a near fatal condition. So be very careful, guys. This is something that we don't want to see happen out there. So be really careful with that around the house. So be very careful with anything like that. When in doubt, test it. It's not that expensive to test it. There's labs in most metropolitan areas, and you could take it at least down there and see what you're working with. So when in doubt, have it tested. You'll be much happier. All right, we come back. I'm going to talk about one that we haven't talked about for a few years in the show here, but some of the most toxic stuff in your shop could be the wood you're working with. We'll do that just as soon as Around the House returns. Welcome back to the Around the House show, the next generation of home improvement. I'm Eric G. Thanks for joining me today. If you're listening to us on the Talk Media Network, thanks for tuning in on the radio. And of course, I appreciate all you podcasters out there that are listening. Today, we've been talking about different projects. There's that wall load bearing. We talked about that earlier if you're just joining us. And we've been talking about toxic projects. And this is another one that we got to be really careful with. Toxic wood and wood allergies. And there is a huge one here. And I'm a person, I totally get this. This is something that I have run into, and maybe it's because I've done enough projects out there, but I'll be out working, and if you see me on the TV, sometimes you'll see the redness on my face and on my neck. That is me having an allergic reaction to some sawdust that I was dealing with. So what have I been doing? I've been using vacuum systems much more. I have 2 different ones, trying to eliminate as much of the dust and pollutants of just dealing with it on my skin. But here's the thing, excessive exposure to certain kinds of wood dust can cause some serious ailments, including bronchial asthma, rhinitis, which is a constantly running nose, and then you get a hypersensitivity pneumonia, for instance, organic dust toxic syndrome. That's a big one. Bronchitis, dermatitis, nasal cancers are rare, but they can occur. Usually that's for people working in cabinet shops in the furniture industry. And cancer of the upper respiratory tract can be caused by many kinds of wood dust, including, yes, beech and oak. So that's a big one right there. So let's talk about it. Some woods, like, for instance, act as sensitizers. When first used, there's no reaction, but after you working with it over and over again, that user becomes sensitized. So each contact with the wood becomes a pretty bad allergic reaction. Now, you'll see this many times in auto body shops. You'll see auto techs that are working in the auto body world. They haven't been using respirators. They haven't been wearing their suits. And all of a sudden, one day, they just can't get anywhere near that. So some of the sensitizers we see in wood is beech, mahogany, sequoia, redwood, willow, and teak. If you're allergic to aspirin, be very cautious of willow and birch, because they have a very similar effect. So be very careful. Now, one of the things we really need to be careful with, and this is something that you don't think about, but it really causes a problem. So microorganisms in bark and fungus can induce bronchial asthma, allergic dermatitis, rhinitis, those kind of things. In North America, maple bark strippers disease is due apparently to a mold, basically. And so that gets inhaled, and you got a problem right there. So be very careful with. So now another one that's interesting, subtropical and tropical woods noted for allergic effect: western red cedar, sequoia, redwood, obeche, cocobolo, masonia. Those woods from temperate climates tend to produce a less extreme effect, but you got to be really careful with those. Another one should be treated with caution: larch, walnut, oak, beech, yew, and pine. So these are all things we got to be really careful with and make sure that we're not creating too much dust. And this is something that you got to be really careful with, because if you have maybe that workshop in the basement and that dust is getting upstairs, that can be pretty big deal. So which woods are toxic? So there are a number of wood species that are considered to be dangerous to your health. And let's talk a little bit about those. Can you be allergic to wood? Yeah, some people can be susceptible to allergies caused by wood. And so be very careful with this. So one of the things that I want to make sure we're doing is that we're working in well-ventilated areas. We're using dust control, that kind of stuff, to make sure that I want you to be able to do these projects for years on end. So just make sure you're following all those, and then make sure and wash and shower frequently. Wash your work clothes, and I would wash these work clothes indifferent than the rest of your laundry. Wear gloves, lots of respirators, face masks, those kind of things. And then avoid working with unseasoned wood, because there's a lot more of things that could be in that as far as molds and things like that. So be really careful. So be very careful with that. All right, now let's talk about here. Another one to be cautious of course, is any of the bonded woods like plywood, MDF. Any of those things can also create that kind of stuff. So be very careful with that. So let's talk a little bit more about toxic wood here. I want to talk about just basically the list. And I'm not going to get down into each one of these because that would be some really boring projects here. And we're not going to go down this whole thing like an encyclopedia, because guess what? That's a really boring discussion. But I want to have some of these so you can understand. So if you're out there driving, listen to the show. I'm going to hit some of the big stuff that I've worked with before, and that's pretty common in woodworking out there. So big leaf maple, again, the dust, bronchial asthma, dermatitis, rhinitis. That's a big one. Soft maple may affect lung function, and that is the dust. Same with hard maple. So a hard rock maple, be very careful. Some of the ones here that there's a lot of different ones here on my list that I'm working down, like a Rhodesian teak, respiratory inflammation, irritation. Now, common one, yellow birch, dermatitis, respiratory problems. Same thing here when you get into some of these other woods here. Sweet chestnut, dermatitis out of the bark and the lichens. Another one that's really interesting, South American cedar. We get something there where we get into that dust, the wood, that kind of stuff. So be very careful. The other one here that we're working on that we got to be very careful with, cocobolo, sensitizer, irritant to skin, nose, throat, nausea, wheezing, chest tightness, headache, that kind of stuff. So sapele, which is a mahogany type product, skin irritation, sneezing, blue gum, dust. You're getting where I'm going here, guys. So look up the woods that you're working with. This can be something that is pretty rough, and I just want to make sure that we're all staying very healthful and making sure that we're being careful. Another one here that I think we should take a look at here, American walnut, which I love working with, but it is an irritant to the eyes and skin, and that is the dust and the wood. So that's a big one right there. So be very careful with that. And when you get into the more exotic woods, just take a look at it. Wenge is another one. I love working with wenge. Splinters go septic, irritation of eyes, skin and respiratory system, dermatitis, giddiness, drowsiness, visual problems, stomach cramps, sensitizer from the dust and the wood. So you see where we're going here. Some of this stuff here is really interesting to work with. Purple heart. I've had this before. This is one of the woods that really got my attention. Nasal irritation and nausea, both from the dust and the wood. And that's a big one right there. Just regular pine, decrease in lung function, irritant, dermatitis from the dust and the wood. So Doug fir, dermatitis, nasal cancer, rhinitis, respiratory problems, splinters go septic from Doug fir. And that's from the dust and the wood. So take a look, guys. Go on the list here. I will post this page up on social media here this weekend so you can take a look at it. It's really, really good. It's a really good story here that they did some serious work on. It's from a website, Would You Choose? Really good information. Did some research to find out where we get the best of that information, guys. So be really careful with woods like this, because I tell you what, I have been learning this, and it's something that I've been dealing with. And I want to make sure that everybody is staying healthy out there. and it's just wood, right? Yeah, until we all get sick or somebody's running into some health issues, and we don't want to see that. So want you guys tuning in the show all the time. Want you guys to have fun working on woodworking projects and doing the stuff you love. But there's also some health hazards that just want to make sure that you're not jumping in and thinking about it going, ooh, got to be careful with that. So, all right, guys, be careful out there. I don't want to sound too preachy. Now, when we come back here, we're going to talk about some of the other things you need to be really careful with around the shop here and stuff that can really be dangerous. And these are the kind of these other hazards or even toxic. And we'll talk about that when we come back. If you want to find out more about us, or if you've got something that's happened to you, I want to hear about it. Send a message over. Head over to aroundthehouseonline.com. We've got a whole thing right there. And the cool thing with that is over at Around the House Online, you can send me a message. You can give me a call in the studio. You can be a part of the conversation either way. I want to hear what you've got to say, and I appreciate you. Around the House will be right back after these important messages. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Around the House show, the next generation of home improvement. We've been talking about project questions. There's that wall load bearing. We started talking about toxic stuff that was in your garage, maybe that woodworking project you're working on. And so there's so much more stuff here I want to talk about, and some of the stuff that you just want to be careful with in your garage now that we're talking about it. Make sure that if you got kiddos, pets, that kind of stuff, just keep them out of the garage if you're storing stuff in it. Whether it's pool chemicals or greases and oils, that stuff can be horribly mixed badly. If you put stuff together out there, I'm not going to give you any ideas, but you know that there's some dangerous stuff when you start mixing stuff together. So make sure you're storing it correctly per the manufacturer's recommendations and out in a shed or something not attached to your house. So that way, if it is off-gassing, you're not having to deal with that. Now, one of my tricks to do on projects, especially if you're tackling a big one, let's say you're like, hey, I'm going to do siding on my house, or I'm going to do a new roof project or whatever. One of the nice things you can do is go get some rental tools. I tell you what, that has been something that I've been doing more and more of because I have limited space. And that is one of the nice things when you have a project is that maybe you don't need that big, huge, massive table saw hanging around all year round. Maybe you just need a small one. And then when you have that big project, head down to your favorite tool rental store and get something bigger, use it, and then return it back to them, use it for the day or two that you need it, and save some space in your garage or shop. And if you're doing a lot of woodworking projects, man, load up. You guys out there, ladies and gents, load up on the tools you need. But for many of us that don't have that much space, or you just start running out of it, make sure that you've got that kind of dialed in. Sometimes it's just easier to rent the tools you need for the time and then go after it. I don't have a massive air compressor. I have a lot of the smaller ones. I just don't need one. But when I do need one, I go rent it because it saves me a ton of money. And it's one more thing that I don't have to store. So take a look at tool rental is a great way on those projects to be able to save a little bit of money. Buy it when you need it. Many times, if you're using it once or twice a year, it might just be easier to rent it. And that way, when you're done with it, you can take it back, clean it up. And for pennies on the dollar, you can go out and use that thing and then not have to pay to store it. And that's one of the things that I think that we should always pay attention to is storage units are expensive. I have one now just to store stuff. And man, it's irritating writing that check each month. That is money that I'm just literally throwing away. And so that means I need to build another shed. I've got one out back and I'm going to have to do another one here just because it will be cost effective. If you're spending $150 a month, it doesn't take long for that to make sense to go, hey, maybe I'll invest in a year's, go build myself a shed. That can be a great way to get that done. So that's another good one there. And now another thing here that I want to talk about when it comes to projects is somewhat controversial for people out there. When do you pull that building permit? When do you not? And a lot of those times, this is one of those things that comes down to where you are located. Like in my area here, if you're building a new deck, if it's under 30 inches high, permit's not needed. I'm good. Same with a deck cover. If I'm going to build a cover, if it's under 200 square feet and it's built in a certain way, I don't need to pull a permit for it. That's great. But if I'm building a deck that's 36 inches high where I need a railing and some stairs probably, I need to pull full building permits for it. Now, many times you don't need that for a fence, but I've seen it in certain areas where they have design codes and HOAs and stuff where you need to pull things. So really pay attention. It's really harder to get away with permits that are needed, especially on exterior projects. I know people, that's the one thing I love about the radio show and the podcast is I hear stories from across the US and worldwide. And I know here in the US, there are some cities, some counties, some states, some townships that are using satellites like Google Earth and other paid private organizations that have their own satellites to be able to tell who's done a roof, who's done a deck, who's built stuff, and they can go back 10 years and see what you had. I went back to see how long the tarps were on the blue tarp house in Cannon Beach that we've been working on. I went back to 2013 and went, wow, there were still tarps in 2013 on that house. So you can get an idea of what's existing and what's not, which means if you get into a knockdown, drag them out with your local building permit office, guess what? That could get expensive because they have satellites to be able to tell you what you did on the outside of the house. Now, the other thing I've seen too is they have gone on and pulled up listing information from other websites. So maybe they jump on Zillow or Redfin or Realtor.com and your pictures from before that complete remodel are hanging up there. You're like, oh, nobody will ever catch me. It's inside the house. Guess what? They can. And here's the thing. Will they most likely catch you? Maybe, maybe not. All it takes is that angry neighbor. And that's really what it comes down to. I have seen Saturday afternoons, an inspector show up at a buddy's place who was swapping out a window, and a neighbor had called it in, and that is one of them. Now, in my state here in Oregon, if you're an unlicensed contractor, they have people driving around searching for you. They're following people out of lumber yards. They are on the hunt for unlicensed contractors, which is awesome. Go after those guys. I'm cool with that. But the building department, not really. But here's where you get nailed. It's that person next door that has the permit, or maybe the house down at the end of the street that's remodeling. And when that inspector comes driving by, and I saw this happen, this was something that happened, and I'll tell the story now because the unfortunate architect is no longer with us, died from cancer a number of years ago. It was a project I was working on in Seattle. Known architect, I'll leave it at that. He was doing a full condo renovation. I was the kitchen and bath designer for it. He had me doing his kitchen and bath design. He was doing the big architectural spaces in there. And so this was drafting. This was a long time ago, hand drafting. This guy wanted these plumbing fixtures out of Europe. I believe they were Duravit, if I remember right, but they hadn't been certified for the US yet. So they didn't have our stamps, didn't have the UPC stamps or anything on them. So they were not legitimate US for sale yet. He had them ordered in, paid to have them shipped in, showed up, and just when the plumbing truck was out front, hauling the pieces in, the head building inspector for the city of Seattle is hoofing it down the sidewalk, and he sees it and follows it up into the building, walks right up at the delivery drivers, walks into a condo by a renowned architect that is gutted to the studs without a single building permit. And I tell you what, if you want to see somebody get an example made out of him, it was ugly. And it's not that they were doing things wrong. It was when you're in condos, for instance, and that's what this was. There are codes in condos that are different from homes. And in homes, we could use ABS pipe or PVC pipe. They wanted in drainage, they wanted all copper for drains. He didn't want to do it. Guess what? Had to come out, get ripped out. Had to pay to get this stuff certified for the states just so he could use the plumbing stuff. It delayed his project probably 9 months because he had to go through all these different hoops. So just be careful out there. I would say pull permits when you can. And I get it for some of the dumb stuff. People go, it's not worth it. I get it. But technically, you should be pulling permits when you need to. I tell you not to. But more importantly, this stuff is there to make sure that, one, you don't burn your house down. Two, you don't ruin something with bad plumbing code, electrical code violations, structural, all those kind of things. So those are there to protect your life, health, safety, and welfare. So it's not about the quality of the job. It's just there to make sure that it meets the minimum so that you can be safe. More importantly, the people that are next door, the people that are going to buy it from you down the road, that they're safe. So I really want to make sure that people out there are doing these things correctly, pulling the codes. I had an electrician. I paid an electrician to come in and do my electrical panel in here because could I have done it myself? Absolutely. But you know something, sometimes when it comes down to what's my time worth and do I want to make sure that it's done correctly, especially when I had a panel that was about ready to catch on fire, it was good to know that all my electrical was done correctly and it's safe. So it's okay to ask for help. And yeah, electrical panels are expensive. They're much more expensive now than they were just a couple years ago, especially with the new breakers and stuff. That adds up very quickly, and I get it. But please, guys, when you can, make sure that you're pulling those building permits, getting it up to code. So that way, if you go to sell it down the road, somebody comes back and goes, wow, this wasn't done correctly. You're not going to have to do it twice. And right when you're trying to sell something, nobody wants to deal with that. And so there you go. Just be very careful, guys. I want to make sure that you're protected, your family, and the other people around you. So those are some more project information to make sure you're tackling that correctly. But have some fun. If you're doing some remodels out there, I know things are expensive. Sheesh. Plywood prices right now, sheetrock prices, yeah, they are crazy. And it's tough. I've been really trying to search for projects coming up, searching from the building material outlets, looking at donated materials. Yeah, new stuff is expensive out there, guys. It is adding up. All right, guys, that wraps up the first episode of Around the House Show. If you want to catch the second episode, catch the next one on the podcast or on the radio show. Thanks for tuning in to Around the House.
Come on.
Hey, it's Eric G. with Around the House. Are you looking to grow your business? Need a spokesperson for your company? Maybe an MC for an upcoming trade show? Or maybe you want to up your game and shoot some promotional videos? My team of experts would love to chat with you. Head to AroundTheHouseOnline.com and fill out the Contact Us form, and we'll set something up. Thanks for listening to Around the House.